kinds of possibility. So one kind of possibility is so-called logical possibility. Something is logically possible if it does not violate the laws of nature. I'm sorry, geez, the laws of logic. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. Laws of logic. So our existence does not violate the laws of logic, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. That does not violate the laws of logic. But if you say something like x is true and x is false at the same time, that seems to violate the laws of logic. Something Aristotle called the law of non-contradiction. So, P is both true, where P is a proposition, P is both true and false, violates the law of non-contradiction. Okay, that's one kind of possibility. Another kind of possibility is so-called physical possibility. So something is physically possible if it does not violate the laws of nature. So a physical impossibility, an example, would be for you to stand up right now and jump over the moon. Simply can't do it, right? Is it logically possible for you to stand up right now and jump over the moon? Does it violate any laws of logic?
Yes, a lot.
It doesn't. There's no logical contradiction involved with your standing up and jumping over the moon. It's a physical impossibility, but it's not a logical impossibility.
So is that like the atom? It's
Now,
logically possible.
Well, we'll get to that. Now, how can we show that it's logically possible for you to do it? Well, imagine a possible world that has different laws of physics and at which you can jump over the moon. You can imagine that, right? Contrast that with the following. Imagine a round square. Can you think of any possible world at which there exist round squares without changing the meaning of round and square? No, right? See, round squares, those are a logical impossibility. And so I can't think of any possible worlds that have round squares. I can think of plenty of possible worlds where I can jump over the moon. Now those are distant possible worlds, right? Those are worlds that are very different from ours. But now let's think of close possible worlds. Can you think of a possible world at which this television does not exist? Sure. It's a world very much like ours, but in which the people who produced TVs didn't happen to produce that particular TV. So you have to change some things, but not a whole lot. So philosophers love to talk about possible worlds all the time, right? Philosophers will say, well, imagine that aliens come down and they are of this type of da-da-da-da-da, right? You're describing a possible world.
Is that like the multiverse theory kind of?
That's kind of like that, except here you're describing possible universes, right? So the multiverse, there are physicists who believe that there in fact exists an infinite number of universes, and they represent all the different possibilities, right? Physical possibilities. I don't know enough about it to say whether in the multiverse theory that there are universes that have different physical laws from ours. If so, then yeah, you're getting into this, right? So you're just describing different universes out there. Okay. But notice that even in the multiverse theory, there are no universes with square circles, because that's a logical impossibility. So here's one thing that we know. At every possible world, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. Otherwise you're violating the laws of logic, right? You can't do that. Now let's think then, let's get back to the atom that I've described. We've got the atom, and it has always existed, and it will always exist in our world. Does that make it a necessary being based on some of the stuff we can say? Well, what would be a necessary being according to this understanding of possibility? Let's start this way. What's a necessary truth? Okay, that's an example of a necessary truth. 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. So what does it mean to say that that truth is necessary?
It's always true, no matter what.
What does always mean? Be careful. Not merely eternally, but it's true logically, which means it's true at all possible worlds, yes. Okay? So a necessary truth is a truth, right? Something is true at all possible worlds. A necessary being then must be,
True in all worlds,
right?
possible world.
Yeah, something that exists at all possible worlds. So I've erased what I had up here before. Here's a way of understanding what a possible being is then, based on all of this. We could say, well, a possible being is something that exists at least one possible world. Unicorns are possible beings, right? They don't actually exist, but I can describe a world at which they exist. Square circles are not possible beings. You are a possible being. You exist in at least one possible world. This one. And perhaps many more. Right? So a necessary being, then, on this understanding, will be, obviously, something that exists at all possible worlds.
possible world be a world of nothing?
That's controversial. And the reason that it's controversial has to do with the existence of numbers and the existence of the empty set.
With the empty
So suppose that you have a world in which nothing exists, then presumably the null set exists. But the problem is that if the null set exists, so does a set whose only member is the null set, and thus so does a set whose members are the null set and the set whose member is the null set. And there's a kind of number theory that defines numbers in terms of sets. So if you admit the existence of the null set, then you get all these other sets, and hence you get the existence of numbers. And so there's an argument that numbers must exist at least at all possible worlds. So Pythagoras was right? Everything is reducible to numbers.
So numbers are.
But I have no idea about the existence of the empty set. That's controversial. All right, so I don't know. All right, so here's one possible critique, right? It is impossible for possible beings always to exist. You might think, well, that's false. I can have eternally existent beings that are still possible beings because I can describe possible worlds at which they don't exist. Good. That's one possible critique of this. Very important one. Sorry, I was pointing on for. What about this, though? Let's focus now. You might think, well, all this is 20th century stuff about possible worlds and blah, blah, blah. Let's take his argument on their own terms, right? His own understanding of possibility and necessity. If everything were a possible being, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence. Do you buy that? Yeah.
Is it possible for there always to be possible beings always in existence?
Okay. How can you describe that?
There's just no beginning of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
Time isn't linear.
there's a problem here in this understanding of everything, right? If everything were a possible being, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence. Well, there's two ways of understanding everything, right? By everything, we could mean each individual thing, or everything could be existence as a whole. So let's see what happens here when we plug these two meanings in. Take this first one. Everything means each individual thing. So if each individual thing that exists were a possible being, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence. And you say, false, right? Because as you described it, you could say, well, wait a minute, here's something that exists in time, and here's something that exists in time, and here's something that exists in time. So why can't you have this kind of overlap going back infinitely into the past and infinitely into the future? So if by everything he means each individual thing, no, this doesn't work. But what if you mean existence as a whole? If existence as a whole were a possible being, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence. And there you might say, well, okay, maybe I buy that. But why think of everything in that way as a possible being? In other words, why not think of existence itself as necessary? Okay? It is necessary that something exists. Okay? Yeah.
Oh, that's what I was gonna say.
So, what we have here is this ambiguity in this notion of everything. Here's a logic lesson for the day. There's something called the fallacy of equivocation. And this occurs when a term is used in different ways in an argument. And that seems to be what's going on here. So you equivocate when the meaning of your term shifts. So here he's talking about individual things, right? These first two premises. Well, if everything were a possible being, then at one time, what? And that can't work, right? But if everything is a whole, right, then it works. But now it's like, well, what reason do we have for thinking that because there exist individual possible things, why think that everything as a whole is a possible being? Maybe everything as a whole is your necessary being, right? Maybe existence itself is necessary. In which case, why do you need God? I'm not getting good feedback from your faces today. Some of you are looking completely bewildered, bored. I'm hoping it's the heat in here that's putting people to sleep and not my lecture. Now there is an interesting argument to say, to actually show that God is a necessary being, but it's not this one. And I will not hold you responsible for this because it's a pretty high level logic, but it goes like this. Let diamond P equal, it's possible that P. Let square P equal, it's necessary that P. Let P equal God exists. So it's possible that God exists. It's necessary that God exists. Now the question is this. Is it at least possible that God necessarily exists? Is it at least possible that God is a necessary being?
Yeah.
Conclusion. Then God is a necessary being.
Because it's possible.
That's right. Because think about how we've defined possibility. If it's possible, that necessarily P, then there is a possible world at which necessarily P. If there's a single possible world at which necessarily P, then P is true at all possible worlds. God necessarily exists.
Well, couldn't you say that about anything? I mean, instead of God, you could use flying spaghetti monster.
Is it possible that I'm a necessary being?
Yeah.
No, because I can describe a world in which I don't exist.
Well, then you wouldn't be describing it, because you couldn't describe it because you wouldn't exist.
No, I do exist. And I'm describing it now. I'm describing a possible world where I don't exist. So it's really not possible that I'm a necessary being. But God, by definition, a necessary being, it's possible that God is a necessary being. Therefore, God exists as every possible world. Just prove God's existence in one line, right?
So easy.
All right, next week we're going to talk about the design.